Date: October 7th, 2016. Location: Central City. Every afternoon as the golden California sun filtered through the glass-paneled ceiling of LAX Terminal 4, 15-year-old Jamal Carter carved out a quiet pocket of resistance in a world too loud, too fast, and too indifferent to boys like him. With his back pressed against the cool wall just beneath the arrivals monitor and his knees pulled tight to his chest, he balanced a second-hand algebra textbook, its corners bent and pages smudged, while the battered tablet resting in his lap flickered with a low battery warning he couldn't afford to solve. The air buzzed with the scent of overpriced coffee and jet fuel, and the endless murmur of boarding calls echoed like background noise in a movie he wasn't invited to star in. Jamal wore the same faded hoodie he'd had since 7th grade, the sleeves now riding up his growing arms, and his sneakers, passed down from a cousin in Oakland, had more soul showing than rubber. His fingers were ink-stained from hours of solving equations, and his stomach growled a quiet protest from having skipped lunch again, but none of it slowed him. Every calculation was a protest. Every page was a prayer. He studied in the middle of chaos, not for fun, not for extra credit, but because he had to win, because no one was coming to save him, and this was the only weapon he had. Across the terminal, behind a security door labeled "Authorized Personnel Only," his mother, Angela Carter, was pushing a mop across the gleaming floors of a first-class lounge where no one looked like her and no one ever said thank you. She wore a janitor's uniform that hung too loose on her small, wiry frame, her hair tied back in a scarf to keep sweat from stinging her eyes as she worked through her second double shift of the week. A single mother since Jamal was a baby, Angela hadn't had a real night's sleep in years. Her hands were raw from chemicals, her knees worn from scrubbing floors, and her body felt like it had aged 20 years for every 5 she survived in the city. But her spirit, unbreakable. When Jamal was younger, she used to bring him to the airport on weekends, let him nap on folded blankets in the break room while she worked. But those days were gone. He was growing, learning, needing more. A few months ago, Jamal had begged her to let him start working too. He said he could take on part-time jobs, maybe help cover groceries or internet bills. Angela had turned on him with eyes full of fire, her voice low but fierce. "No, you don't get to trade your future for pennies. You ain't cleaning no toilets, Jamal. Not while I've got strength in my body. You're gonna study and you're gonna rise. That's how we win, baby." So he studied, every day, at the airport, between terminals, behind vending machines. He memorized formulas while watching people race to gates for business-class flights they never had to earn. He solved science problems while listening to security guards question kids who looked like him a little too long, and he kept his head down. Because Jamal knew the rules. Stay invisible, stay quiet, don't give anyone a reason to think you're a threat. But inside that quiet boy was a mind burning with ambition, a heart that refused to surrender. Jamal didn't just want to pass. He wanted to fly. He wanted to build. He wanted more than surviving in a rented apartment in South Central Los Angeles, where the walls were cracked and the heater groaned in the winter. Their home was a crumbling place patched together with duct tape, prayers, and love, where Angela slept on the couch to give Jamal the only bedroom, and every dollar was counted 3 times before it was spent. There were nights when the electricity threatened to cut off, mornings when the fridge was mostly empty, and moments when Angela cried silently in the bathroom so her son wouldn't hear. But they had dreams, and they had each other. Jamal didn't know it yet, but the rhythm of his hard-fought routine was about to be shattered. In a matter of hours, the airport, once a symbol of their grind, their struggle, and their waiting, would become the stage for something extraordinary. A fall, a decision, a connection, and the moment where everything, their fate, their future, their world, would begin to change forever. It happened suddenly in the space between one page turn and the next, a break in the background rhythm that Jamal had grown so used to tuning out, the buzz of rolling suitcases, the high heels clicking against marble, the robotic airport announcements calling out gate changes. None of it warned what was about to unfold just 20 feet away. Jamal glanced up from his tablet when he heard it. The unmistakable, dull thud of a body hitting the floor, followed by the scraping clatter of a metal walking cane spinning across the terminal tiles. Heads turned briefly, eyes flicked over, but no one moved. Too busy, too afraid, or too indifferent. Then Jamal saw him, a tall, elderly white man, frail and trembling, collapsed awkwardly beside a row of leather seats near Gate 49. His gray hair was slicked back, neatly groomed, and dark designer glasses covered his eyes. Not fashionable, but functional. He was blind. His suit jacket had ridden up as he fell, revealing a tailored shirt soaked through with sweat, and his skin had gone deathly pale. For a moment he struggled to breathe, clutching weakly at the air, his hand trying to find his cane or a nearby bench that wasn't there. His briefcase had fallen open, papers scattered like forgotten confetti across the cold airport floor. No one stepped in. No one offered help. A few security guards looked in his direction but hesitated, waiting for someone else to act first, their radios buzzing with unrelated noise. Jamal's heart slammed into his chest, not just from alarm, but from the weight of a choice. Sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive. He'd been raised to be cautious in public spaces, especially as a young black boy, especially around white people, especially in moments where the truth could get twisted and intentions could be questioned. His mother had warned him countless times, "You help someone, make sure there's witnesses. You touch someone, make sure it's the right thing." People don't see a boy trying to help. They see a threat, baby. But that man on the floor didn't have time for those rules. He was dying or close to it. His lips were turning blue, his breath shallow, his face contorted in pain. And in that frozen moment, Jamal moved. He shoved his books into his backpack, shot to his feet, and rushed to the man's side. "Sir, are you okay? Can you hear me?" he said, dropping to his knees beside him. The man didn't respond. His fingers were twitching, reaching for nothing. Jamal gently grasped his shoulder. "You need help. Hold on, all right?" His voice cracked but didn't falter. He looked around. No one was moving. A woman in a business suit turned away. A man in uniform muttered into his phone. What the hell is wrong with people? Jamal thought. Panic building. He saw a tea kiosk nearby and bolted to it, slamming down his only $5 bill, his lunch money, for a bottle of calming herbal tea, ignoring the cashier's side-eye glare. He rushed back, lifted the man's head, and tilted the bottle toward his lips, carefully helping him sip. It was something, anything to help calm his nervous system, to keep him from slipping further. The man's breath started to slow, but his hands were shaking uncontrollably, and he whispered something Jamal couldn't understand. Medication, pressure, bag. His suitcase was gone, probably already loaded onto the wrong flight, his blood pressure meds with it. Jamal's pulse pounded as he pulled out his phone, cracked screen and all, and dialed emergency services, explaining the situation with urgency and clarity beyond his years. As he spoke, the old man's breathing became shallower again, his fingers gripping Jamal's wrist as if anchoring himself to life. "Stay with me, man. Just stay with me, okay?" Jamal whispered, his voice soft but fierce. The operators kept him on the line, guiding him through basic aid until the medics could arrive. And somewhere in that chaos, between the spilled papers, the rushing, footsteps of paramedics now running toward them, and the old man's faint grip holding his hand, Jamal's flight was called, his name echoing through the terminal speakers. Gate closed, flight missed, future delayed. But he didn't look up. He didn't care. His attention was locked on this stranger, this blind man the world had passed by, and for the first time in a long time, Jamal Carter wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about doing what was right, even if no one else would. As the paramedics crowded around the collapsed man, slipping an oxygen mask over his face and unpacking a small med kit with methodical precision, Jamal Carter took a step back. Not out of fear, but out of learned habit. He hovered just close enough to answer the EMT's rapid-fire questions. Did he fall suddenly? Any signs of trauma? What did he say before he passed out? But far enough to not draw suspicion, far enough to not be seen as too involved. Because even as his adrenaline spiked and his heart ached with worry for the stranger he'd just helped save, there was still a colder fear coiled deep inside him, one that had been planted young and watered by every injustice he and his mother had endured. The kind of fear that whispers, "Don't touch, don't speak, don't stand too close." The kind of fear that comes from knowing you could help someone and still end up in handcuffs for it. The kind of fear that knows compassion isn't always rewarded when you're a black boy in America. And yet, despite the whispers, despite the racing pulse, and the storm of doubt inside him, Jamal stayed because something bigger had taken root in him in that moment. A defiance born not of anger, but of unshakable humanity. He couldn't walk away. He couldn't pretend the old man didn't matter just because the world did. And that choice, to stay, felt heavier than anything he'd carried before. He had just missed the flight that was supposed to take him to a special youth science seminar in Denver. Something his school counselor had fought hard to get him into, a rare opportunity that could have opened doors and impressed scholarship boards. It was a long shot already, and he knew his absence might mean he'd never get another chance. He thought about the hours he'd spent preparing for it, the bus rides, the essays, the hope, all of it gone with a single decision. But as he stood at the edge of the terminal hallway, watching the paramedics lift the frail, unconscious man onto a stretcher, his wrinkled hand still clinging weakly to the tea bottle Jamal had bought, something inside Jamal shifted. This wasn't about reward or recognition. No one was clapping. No one was even thanking him. In fact, a TSA agent nearby kept throwing him sideways glances, as if waiting to ask for ID, waiting to question him, waiting to decide whether this teenager with dark skin and calloused eyes belonged in the story or was just interfering. Still, Jamal didn't shrink. He squared his shoulders. He answered every medical question calmly. When one of the EMTs, an older Latina woman with soft eyes, asked his name, he gave it clearly. Jamal Carter. I found him like this. He was alone. Nobody helped. So I did. And for the first time that day, someone looked at him not with suspicion, but with respect. As the stretcher rolled away, sirens wailing faintly outside the terminal doors, Jamal stood frozen in place. His backpack hung heavy on one shoulder, his tablet forgotten inside, his stomach still empty, but his soul buzzing with the weight of what he had just done. People brushed past him, late for flights, shouting into phones, arguing about delays. None of them knew what had just unfolded. None of them cared. But he did. He had watched a human being collapse. He had made a choice. Not the easy one, not the one that kept him safe, not the one his mother might have begged him to choose, but the one that made him feel, deep in his core, like he mattered, that he wasn't invisible, that his actions had weight, that he could change something, even if only for one person. The man's name hadn't even been said yet, but his life, his vulnerability, had collided with Jamal's strength in a moment so raw, so real that the consequences didn't matter anymore. He had helped because it was right, because no one else would, because silence in the face of suffering was no longer something he could stomach. Not today, not anymore. As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the flashing lights melted into the Los Angeles haze outside the terminal, Jamal Carter stood motionless, a strange emptiness blooming in his chest. Not of regret, but of realization. He looked back over his shoulder to the big LED display above the gate where, just minutes earlier, his name had flickered in bold letters across the standby list for Flight 272 to Denver, now replaced by the cruel finality of the words, "Departed." The plane, his plane, was already airborne, slicing through blue skies, carrying a dozen other young students like him to a prestigious youth science summit, one he had dreamed of attending since the beginning of the year. He could almost see them now, scrolling through welcome packets, laughing in airport lounges with snacks in hand, wearing matching lanyards belonging to a world he had clawed toward with every ounce of fight in him. That flight wasn't just transportation. It was possibility. It was escape. It was the narrow bridge across the endless canyon between survival and success. He had studied for months to earn that place, written essays by candlelight when the power went out in their apartment, rehearsed his introduction in front of cracked mirrors, stayed up late perfecting his science project while listening to his mother cough herself to sleep in the next room after a night shift. It had taken everything to get to that gate, And in one choice, one selfless moment, it was gone. Sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive. He could already hear the voice of his mother, Angela, in his mind, tired but fierce. "You worked too hard for this, baby. You were supposed to be on that plane." And he knew she'd be right, but he also knew she'd understand, deep down, because she was the one who had raised him, not just to chase success, but to carry his integrity like a second heartbeat. Still, as Jamal slowly walked back to the bench, where his backpack sat waiting like an abandoned child, the weight of the missed flight began to settle into his bones like cold rain. He unzipped the front pouch with shaking fingers, pulled out the folded confirmation letter, creased and wrinkled from being read too many times. "Congratulations," it still said, as if mocking him now. "We are honored to welcome you to the Youth Innovators of Tomorrow program." He stared at the words, numb, as the terminal returned to its indifferent rhythm. People bustling past him, announcements droning overhead. The same melody of movement he had once found comfort in, now feeling like a song he no longer belonged to. Somewhere far away, that opportunity was fading behind jet streams, and he was just a boy with nothing in his hands but a piece of paper and the silence of knowing he'd given it all up for a stranger whose name he still didn't know. But even in that heavy silence, there was no bitterness in Jamal's chest. Disappointment, yes. Sadness, undoubtedly. But no bitterness. Instead, a strange clarity had begun to settle over him like a second skin, because for the first time, he understood the real cost of empathy. He didn't just lose a flight, he had lost a key, maybe even a future. And yet, in return, he had proven something to himself that no scholarship panel could measure. That when the world asked him who he was, when it put him in a moment where no one would blame him for walking away, he had answered not with words but with action. That choice, that sacrifice, wouldn't show up on a resume. It might not earn him a certificate, but somewhere in his gut, Jamal knew it meant something. He had saved a life. He had done what others wouldn't. And even if the doors of the elite world were now closing behind him, he had opened something deeper inside his own soul, something unshakable. With his head down and his bag slung across one shoulder, he turned toward the waiting area, phone in hand, fingers hovering over his mother's number, unsure of how to explain what had just happened. He had no answers, no next steps. All he knew was that the ground beneath him had shifted, and the boy who sat studying in airports, quiet and invisible, was not the same boy who now stood under the fluorescent lights of Gate 49, having traded a future for a stranger, and not knowing yet that this stranger would soon become the key to a future far greater than any flight could ever promise. It was the third missed call that finally cracked Angela Carter's composure. Standing alone in the dim janitorial closet tucked between two premium lounges, she stared at the glowing screen of her phone with a kind of dread that only mothers know. Deep, raw, instinctual. Her break was supposed to be over 10 minutes ago, but her son hadn't checked in like he always did, and now the time read 2:37 p.m., 27 minutes past the scheduled boarding of Jamal's flight to Denver. Her stomach turned as she dialed again, pressed the phone tight to her ear, listening to nothing but rings that felt like needles. The air in the closet smelled like bleach and sweat and silence, and the ache in her feet was now eclipsed by the panic rising in her chest. Angela wasn't the type to jump to worst-case scenarios. Life had trained her to stay calm under pressure, to keep her hands steady even while her world cracked at the edges. But this was different. Jamal was her heart outside her body, her one reason to keep going through back-to-back shifts, through nights of no sleep, through years of holding this family together with barely more than grit, grace, and prayers muttered over utility bills. She yanked open the door and stepped back into the sterile, overlit corridor, her cleaning cart forgotten behind her, her name tag swinging as she began to walk fast, then faster, then near running through the service halls that wove beneath the terminal. She burst into the public area with sweat on her brow and her eyes scanning, sharp and frantic, past strangers and staff and suitcases. Her uniform drew looks, some indifferent, some dismissive, but she moved like a storm wrapped in silence. When she reached gate 49, her heart skipped as she saw him. Jamal standing alone, head bowed, the curve of his shoulders unfamiliar. "Jamal!" she called, her voice cutting through the noise, and he looked up, eyes tired, face pale, no luggage beside him. She rushed to him, grabbed his face in her hands, looked him over for bruises, injuries, answers. "Are you okay? What happened? Did you miss your flight? Baby, talk to me." Her voice was stern but shaking, a mother's edge honed by fear. Jamal opened his mouth, but before he could speak, one of the EMTs nearby approached, gently placing a hand on Angela's arm. "Ma'am, your son helped save a man's life today," the woman said quietly, respectfully. "He didn't just help. He stayed with him, took charge. We might have lost him otherwise." For a second, Angela blinked as if the words hadn't quite reached her. Then her eyes shifted to her son. Not just the boy she'd raised, but the man he was becoming. His hands still trembling slightly, his face holding a weight he shouldn't have had to carry, and her heart broke and soared at once. She wrapped her arms around him, fierce and unyielding, whispering, "You did right, baby. You did more than right." Her voice cracked as she held him tighter, like if she let go, he might drift away into the vastness of this hard, cold world. Then she turned to the EMT. "Where is he?" "The man?" The medic gestured to the side where the stretcher had been wheeled. "They're stabilizing him now. We're about to transport." Angela nodded, jaw clenched, then did something Jamal didn't expect. She took charge. She marched over to a security guard, badge still visible under her janitor's uniform, and demanded access to assist. She spoke with fire, calling in favors from workers she'd helped for years. Baggage handlers, shift supervisors, med techs, even a nurse from the airport clinic who once owed her a lunch break. With swift, commanding presence, she arranged for medical documentation, temporary medication, even an emergency voucher for a nearby hotel. She was no longer just a mother or a cleaning lady. She was a force. Her knowledge of the airport was intimate, hard-earned over years of invisible labor, and now she wielded it like a general taking the battlefield. Not for praise, not for payment, but because someone had needed help, and her son had stood up first. If the world wasn't going to step in, Angela Carter would make damn sure it did now. The hotel room wasn't fancy, just a modest airport accommodation with aging carpet, a humming mini fridge, and curtains that didn't quite close all the way. But for Mr. William Harrison, it might as well have been a sanctuary. He lay propped up against a stack of stiff white pillows, color slowly returning to his face, an IV drip snaking from his arm, while machines blinked beside him in quiet rhythm. The medical team had done what they could to stabilize him, but the true triage had happened long before the ambulance arrived, when a boy with nothing to gain gave him everything he had, and a woman with tired hands moved the system like she owned it. Angela sat in the corner, her janitor's uniform still damp with sweat, her arms folded tight across her chest, not out of defensiveness, but out of muscle memory. Jamal sat at the edge of the bed, uneasy, unsure, still processing the whirlwind of the last few hours. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Why did he collapse? Who was he really? Why did no one else stop? But for now, the room held only silence, punctuated by the distant hum of planes rising and falling outside the windows. Then Mr. Harrison stirred, his head tilting slightly toward Jamal's voice, as if tracking by instinct rather than sight. "You're still here," he rasped, voice sandpaper dry but rich with dignity. Jamal nodded, then caught himself. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I'm here." The old man's face turned slightly toward the boy, a smile forming that looked fragile but real. "You could have left. Everyone else did." That simple sentence hung in the air, heavy and loaded, a truth they all felt deep in their bones. Angela leaned forward, cautious but curious, studying the man. He wore wealth like a second skin, designer slacks, gold cufflinks, a watch worth more than her monthly rent, but now stripped of stature, IV and arm, sweat still clinging to his brow. He was just another body that had nearly broken under the weight of this world. "You need your meds?" she asked bluntly, her tone more nurse than maid. "We got the airline tracing your luggage. Should have it by morning." William gave a faint chuckle. "Efficient. I like that." Then after a pause, he added, "You're his mother, aren't you?" Angela gave a single nod. Yeah, I am. And suddenly something shifted. A moment cracked open between them, not rich and poor, not black and white, not janitor and executive, just three people connected by the messy grace of one terrible, beautiful moment. William adjusted his glasses slightly, even though they didn't help him see. You raised him right, he said. Not many kids would do what he did. Not many adults either. Jamal flushed but said nothing, staring at the floor, unsure how to respond to praise from someone who likely lived in penthouses and spoke at conferences. Angela's eyes softened slightly, but her tone remained guarded. He missed a flight, a big one, something he worked hard for. William nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. And yet, he stayed. That tells me more than any resume ever could. What followed was not a conversation. It was a slow unraveling of barriers. William, in fits and starts, told them who he was. Executive Director of the Harrison Family Foundation, a philanthropic empire with fingers in education, healthcare, and youth development across the country. His blindness, the result of a degenerative disease, had come late in life, long after the wealth, the power, the accolades. But none of that had protected him from the vulnerability he'd felt on that cold terminal floor, alone and fading, until a teenage boy had stepped in. I've spent years funding programs for underprivileged kids, William said, voice low, almost ashamed. But I never thought I'd be the one who needed saving. By one of them, Angela didn't flinch. He's not one of them. He's my son, and he's going to be somebody, no matter what it takes. Her voice had steel in it, not for show, but for survival. William simply nodded, folding his hands over his chest. Yes, he said quietly. Yes, he is. And in that moment, without the need for more words, something ancient and human passed between them, an acknowledgement beyond class, beyond race, beyond circumstance. A shared understanding that the world doesn't always reward goodness, but goodness still matters. And sometimes it even saves a life. Sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive. The sun was starting to set behind the skyline of Los Angeles, casting long golden streaks across the beige hotel room walls. When Mr. William Harrison, his breath steadier now, his color returned, and his voice gaining back its timbre, turned his head toward Angela and Jamal Carter with a calm precision that felt deliberate, like a man who had decided it was finally time to show the cards he'd been holding close to his chest. The silence stretched just long enough to thicken the air, before he spoke with a quiet clarity that felt heavier than anything they'd heard all day. I want to thank you both, he said, voice crisp but humble, his eyes hidden behind the tinted lenses that did little to shield the gravity of his words. Not just for helping me breathe again, but for seeing me when no one else did. He took a deep breath, as though preparing to cross a threshold. You may not know who I am, but a lot of people in this country do. Jamal blinked, confused, and Angela's brow furrowed in that sharp, instinctual way all single mothers do when they feel something deeper stirring beneath the surface. William reached toward the nightstand and carefully opened a small leather binder his assistant had dropped off during his stabilization. From it, he withdrew a metal business card, sleek, silver, minimalistic. He handed it in Jamal's direction, letting his fingers feel the edge of the boy's palm, as if reading his features through touch. Angela leaned over her son's shoulder and read the engraving slowly, her breath catching halfway through. William Harrison, Executive Director, the Harrison Family Foundation. It didn't click right away, because to working-class families like the Carters, billion-dollar foundations were as far away as constellations. But when William began to speak again, the stars began to align. My family, and we're not just donors, he explained. We shape education policy, fund schools, run programs in 22 states, endow scholarships. We've written checks that built science wings in places like MIT and Harvard. I've personally sat across from presidents, senators, Fortune 500 CEOs, but none of them ever gave me what you did today. Real help, no agenda, no strategy, just decency. That's rare. The words didn't land gently. They thundered in Jamal's mind like a secret door opening. Angela sat back, eyes narrowing slightly, her protective instincts kicking in. "You saying you're some kind of billionaire?" she asked, half disbelieving, half daring him to prove it. William smiled faintly. "I used to run 6 companies before I went blind. Sold them, kept one. Now I run the foundation. I could retire, but I've still got work to do." He let the weight of his legacy settle around them like fog. Jamal, stunned, looked down at the business card again. Suddenly, it felt heavier in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly as he processed the scale of who this man really was, the reality of what had just happened. He hadn't just helped some random stranger. He had saved the life of a man who sat on top of an empire, one whose reach touched every quarter of influence Jamal had always thought was reserved for other people, people with power, pedigree, and privilege. Then came the moment that shifted the air. William turned his head toward Jamal once more and said, "You missed your flight, a very important one. I know what it meant to you, so I'd like to offer you something better." Jamal blinked, unsure he'd heard right. Angela sat upright. William continued, "I want to sponsor your education, son. Not just a scholarship, everything. Full tuition, housing, supplies, mentorship, counseling, even international study if that's where your ambition takes you. And for you, Angela," his voice softened but remained steady, "I want to offer you a position, real salary, full benefits. You'd be overseeing community engagement at the foundation. Your work ethic? That's rare. I want it on my team." The room fell into stunned silence. Jamal looked at his mother, who was staring not at the man, but at her son, eyes shimmering, lips parted, the unspoken words written in every line of her face. Is this really happening? And in that quiet, breathless moment, the weight of struggle, of years spent choosing survival over dreams, seemed to lift just enough to let light in. Jamal's voice finally returned, small and cracked, but alive. "Why me?" he asked. William turned his head, smiling again, not as a businessman, but as a man who had seen the truth. "Because when the world looked away, you looked closer, and you didn't ask who I was before you helped me. That's the kind of person who deserves to lead in it." The offer hung in the air like a door cracked open to a world Jamal Carter had only ever glimpsed from the outside. The kind of world he dreamed of, but never dared to think would reach out and invite him in. For a long moment, neither he nor his mother spoke, the silence between them thick with disbelief, wonder, and the kind of cautious hope that only comes after years of disappointment. Angela Carter, the woman who had mopped the same terminal floors that brought William Harrison to his knees, sat frozen in the chair beside her son, trying to understand how the universe could twist in such an impossible direction in the space of a single day. Her hands, still rough from chemicals and long shifts, gripped the arms of the chair tightly. Not from fear, but to keep herself grounded, because everything in her life had taught her that too good to be true offers usually came with sharp edges. "You want me to work for you?" she finally said, her voice low, guarded, but laced with something else now. Dignity, not doubt. William nodded slowly, his blind eyes fixed on the sound of her voice. "I've worked with hundreds of directors, outreach coordinators, partners. I've hired PhDs, MBAs, people who've never had to fight for anything. But what I saw today, that's leadership. You didn't panic. You didn't flinch. You moved a broken system for a stranger, and you did it with nothing in your pocket but memory and grit. That's not something I can teach. That's something you either are or you aren't." Angela swallowed hard. She had fought for so long, for so many years, just to keep the lights on, to keep Jamal in school, to protect him from the streets waiting outside their apartment like wolves. And now this man was offering her not just a job, but a place at the table, the kind of place no one had ever saved for women like her. And then there was Jamal, still quiet, still stunned, but beginning to feel a shift inside himself, like gravity bending differently in his bones. He stared down at his hands, the same hands that had carried a stranger's weight through a crowd that didn't care, the same hands that had flipped through textbooks beneath flickering lights, that had held back tears when there wasn't enough food in the fridge. Now those hands were being offered a future he hadn't even imagined was real. William turned to him again, and his voice was steady but urgent, as though he understood that this was more than charity. It was an anointing. We don't need more followers in this world, Jamal. We need builders, leaders, men who can walk through fire and still reach back to pull others through. You're that kind of man. I saw it before you ever spoke a word. Jamal's throat tightened, memories flashing in his mind. His mother's exhaustion, the nights they spent counting every dollar, the look on her face when he got that acceptance email, the feeling of being overlooked, underestimated, invisible. But now, someone saw him, not just as a smart kid from South Central, not as a statistic, not as a charity case, but as a force. You'd pay for everything? He asked, voice cracking slightly, still half afraid to believe. Everything, William confirmed. Private school, college, grad school if you want it. Not just tuition, books, travel, mentorship, room and board, and not just school. Opportunity. My network becomes yours. You're not just getting in the door. I'm giving you the keys. Angela's breath hitched as she looked at her son, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope without fear. Tears welled in her eyes, not from weakness, but from the release of decades of held-in struggle. The years of being told no, of doors slammed shut, of watching her son work 10 times harder for half the credit. You sure you know what you're offering? She asked, her voice shaking. William smiled, the lines around his mouth deepening. Yes, ma'am. I know exactly what I'm offering. I'm offering what you both earned, whether the world noticed or not. The room was quiet again, but this time, it was a different kind of silence. Not disbelief, but acceptance, like the hush before sunrise. In that hotel room, the past wasn't erased, but something new had been born. A promise, a path. And for the first time in years, Jamal felt it. Not just hope, but the unshakable conviction that he had not missed his chance at greatness. He had found it, right there on the terminal floor, when he made a choice no one else would make. And now that choice had become the foundation of a future neither he nor his mother would ever have to beg for again. The offer had changed their lives overnight, but escaping poverty is never just about unlocking a door. Sometimes the door creaks, sometimes the hinges bite. Jamal Carter found that out quickly. Within weeks, he had been enrolled at Eastwood Preparatory Academy, one of the top-ranked private schools in Los Angeles. A place so far removed from his old world that the air itself felt different. His first day felt like stepping into a foreign country disguised as a school. Pristine halls, students wearing clothes worth more than his rent, iPads instead of textbooks, and voices filled with names of cities he'd only read about. Teachers were polite but distant. Students were curious but guarded. Some offering fake smiles that didn't reach their eyes, others whispering just loud enough to be heard. Is he the one they're sponsoring? He's from South Central? Like, actual South Central? How'd he even get in? They said it behind locker doors, behind screens. But Jamal heard it all. He wore his uniform like armor, but it didn't always protect him from the invisible barbed wire of expectation and judgment. Every test felt like a battlefield where he couldn't afford to lose. Every wrong answer felt like a threat to everything his mother had sacrificed. Some nights, after hours buried in advanced calculus and biology terms he'd never seen before, he'd sit in the back corner of his new dorm room, headphones on, heart pounding, and wonder if he belonged here at all. The school's glossy brochures had promised opportunity, but not how lonely it would feel to chase it as the only black boy in his honors cohort, the only one whose mother wasn't on a board, whose last name didn't open doors, whose childhood wasn't lined with ski trips and summer internships. Meanwhile, Angela Carter had entered a storm of her own. William Harrison had kept his promise. Within a week, she was sitting in the Foundation's downtown office, no longer wearing a cleaning uniform, but a sharp gray blazer and her own nameplate on a desk. But the transition wasn't smooth. The walls were made of glass. The meetings were full of phrases like data-driven impact and strategic equity partnerships. And the other department heads rarely made eye contact unless they needed something. Her decades of real-world problem-solving, her street smarts, her community ties, none of it came with credentials or Ivy League certificates. She overheard whispers, saw eyes roll when she spoke up in meetings. They said she's passionate, but she's not polished. Angela didn't flinch. She never had. But inside, she was fighting every day not to revert, not to shrink, not to doubt herself in rooms where everything had been designed to exclude her kind long before she walked in. Still, she showed up early, left late, read every report 3 times, memorized the language of power, and slowly, methodically began to prove that what she lacked in polish, she made up for in vision and fire. But it was lonely. The same friends who used to struggle beside her began to pull away, jealousy creeping in, accusing her of selling out or forgetting where she came from. She hadn't forgotten. She just survived, and now she was fighting for more than survival. Sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive. At home, if you could still call their modest new apartment in a safer neighborhood home after everything they left behind. The distance between mother and son sometimes stretched longer than it should have. They were both climbing, both burning through the weight of the past while trying to carry the pressure of the future. They had traded one kind of exhaustion for another. Instead of worrying about food and rent, they worried about proving they deserved the life they were now being offered. Imposter syndrome was a silent roommate, moving in with them, whispering doubts at dinner, sneaking between the lines of progress. But in their quietest moments, on weekends when they sat on the couch and watched old movies, or when Angela ran her fingers through Jamal's hair like she used to when he was little, they remembered why they'd stepped into this new world in the first place. Not for comfort, not for status, but for power. The kind that builds schools, lifts communities, and breaks cycles. The struggle had not ended. In many ways, it had just begun. But now they weren't just surviving the system. They were learning how to navigate it, challenge it, and one day, reshape it from the inside out. Growth came slowly at first, like watching the sunrise through fog, but it came. Jamal Carter, who once sat at airport terminals hunched over secondhand textbooks, now moved through the halls of Eastwood Preparatory Academy with quiet confidence. No longer invisible, no longer unsure. He had learned to tune out the whispers and sharpen his focus, transforming their doubt into fuel. When they laughed at the way he spoke during presentations, he practiced alone at night until his voice cut with precision. When they questioned how he got into the Advanced Robotics Club, he built circuits until his designs outperformed theirs. He wasn't loud, he didn't have to be. His grades spoke, his discipline echoed, his mentors took notice. Mr. Lin, his physics teacher, pulled him aside one afternoon and said, "You don't just have potential, Jamal. You've got vision." And Jamal had begun to see it too, not just who he was, but who he could become. He took on extra credit, stayed late for labs, joined the debate team, even volunteered to tutor struggling middle schoolers on weekends, kids who reminded him of himself not so long ago. Each A grade was more than a letter. It was a rebuke to every system that said boys like him were never meant to be more than a statistic. And yet Jamal wasn't just chasing excellence for himself. He felt it in his bones, that his success had to mean something bigger. He remembered what it was to sit hungry in that terminal. He remembered what it was to be overlooked. So now every test, every project, every sleepless night felt like a building block in a legacy not yet written, but being carved in real time. And Angela Carter, the woman who once mopped the floors outside executive suites, was now walking into those same rooms, not as an outsider, but as a force reshaping them. In the Harrison Foundation's sprawling glass headquarters downtown, her voice, once ignored, had become a compass for change. She had learned their language, yes, but she hadn't lost her own. She spoke in meetings with clarity and conviction, challenging proposals that lacked real community impact, demanding accountability for promises that had once been reduced to photo ops and empty grants. She brought in nonprofit leaders from her old neighborhood. She organized listening sessions with single mothers, youth counselors, and teachers who worked without resources. She didn't just bring a seat to the table. She started building a new one. At first, the other executives resisted, but over time, they couldn't ignore the results. Under her guidance, the Foundation's youth initiative saw its highest engagement rate in a decade. Scholarships were redesigned to reach deeper into forgotten communities. Programs were no longer just top-down donations. They were bridges, structured by real voices. William Harrison, recovering steadily, watched her rise with quiet pride, often telling others, "She doesn't walk into a room like she owns it. She walks in like she rebuilt it herself." And it wasn't just in her work. Angela, for the first time in years, stood taller. Her posture changed. Her laugh returned. She bought books again, novels, poetry, leadership guides, not just to learn, but because she had finally remembered she was allowed to dream too. Together, mother and son moved like a storm gathering momentum. There were still hard days. Days when Jamal questioned if he was enough, when Angela felt the sting of microaggressions dressed as politeness. But now they had tools. They had allies. They had each other. They met on weekends, over takeout and laughter, trading stories about their week. Jamal showing her a 3D prototype he'd built in his engineering class. Angela sharing photos from a youth program she had launched in Watts. Their bond, once forged in struggle, now blossomed in shared purpose. They were no longer chasing opportunity. They were creating it brick by brick. And though the world they had entered still carried barriers, still held its biases close, the Carters were no longer on the outside looking in. They were climbing, rising, not because someone handed them a shortcut, but because when the door opened, they had run through it with everything they had, and then turned back to hold it open for someone else. Years passed, and the city changed, but the rhythm of it, the heartbeat of Los Angeles, pulsing through concrete and steel, struggle and hope, remained the same. And now, standing in the corner office of a downtown skyscraper, high above the streets where he once waited for city buses and counted coins for vending machine snacks, Jamal Carter, 29 years old, stood at the floor-to-ceiling window in a tailored navy suit, his reflection cast in the glass alongside the skyline. He was taller now, broad-shouldered, his once boyish face sharpened by time, experience, and the quiet steel that only comes from surviving storms most people never see. His desk behind him was minimalist but commanding, with a sleek plaque that read, "Jamal Carter, President and CEO, the Harrison Foundation." The title wasn't symbolic. He hadn't inherited the seat, he earned it. After William Harrison's retirement and eventual passing, it had been Jamal, the boy who once missed his flight to save a stranger, who had risen through the ranks with relentless drive and vision. He had restructured programs, expanded outreach, created partnerships in communities the Foundation had previously overlooked. Under his leadership, the Foundation no longer just supported underserved youth. It belonged to them. He knew their hunger, their fire, their fear, because he had lived it, and that made all the difference. Behind the glass walls of his office were portraits, not of donors or politicians, but of students who had made it out, mothers who got their first salaries, communities reborn by the grants he had pushed through. His past had not been erased. It had been engraved into the Foundation's core. Jamal turned from the window as his assistant knocked softly. "They're ready for you," she said, smiling. He nodded, adjusting his cufflinks. Angela's old silver bracelet, now engraved into the lining of his watch band, worn close to his pulse like a quiet prayer. Downstairs, a press conference waited. His new initiative, Rise Forward, aimed to launch 200 community learning centers across low-income neighborhoods in the next 5 years. But it wasn't just about infrastructure. Each center would include a mentorship program, mental health resources, art and STEM programs, and free meals. They would be everything he and his mother had once needed when no one else was listening. And speaking of his mother, Angela Carter, now a respected public speaker, advisor, and board chair, was already down there, waiting in the front row. Her hair was streaked with gray now, her eyes wiser, and she still called him baby when no one was around. They talked every night, no matter how busy their schedules. She had become a quiet legend in her own right, invited to conferences, featured in articles, her story a cornerstone of resilience across communities. Her old co-workers still told the story of how a janitor became the director of outreach, and now helped shape national policy through the foundation she once cleaned for. Jamal's voice came steady now, firm, refined, as he stepped onto the stage and addressed the cameras, the reporters, the kids watching from classroom TVs across the country. "I am not here because I was lucky," he said. "I am here because my mother believed in me when the world didn't. I'm here because one day I chose to help someone instead of walking past. And today we build spaces for those moments to happen again, on purpose." As the crowd rose in applause, Jamal stepped back, letting their voices wash over him, not as validation, but as confirmation. He had become more than anyone expected. More than a survivor, more than a scholarship story, he had become the architect of futures, and all around him, the seeds he and his mother had planted, back when they were broke and invisible and running on borrowed hope, had grown into forests that would shelter generations. Full circle didn't mean returning to where he started. It meant owning the entire path and building bridges where once there were only barriers. And in the silence between applause, Jamal Carter allowed himself a rare moment to close his eyes, breathe deep, and whisper into the echo of memory. "I made it, Ma. We made it." Years later, long after headlines had faded and new voices began to rise, Jamal Carter found himself walking through LAX, not as a stranded teenager with a broken tablet and empty pockets, but as a man whose story had rewritten the blueprint for what was possible. He moved past the same terminal where once, so long ago, a blind man had collapsed and a boy had chosen to kneel beside him rather than walk away. The terminal looked different now, sleek renovations, polished signage, but Jamal could still feel the echo of that moment in the floor beneath his feet, like a pulse, a memory encoded in stone. This time, he wasn't passing through for a flight. He was unveiling a plaque, newly mounted near Gate 49, where it had all begun, etched in bold letters, in honor of the moment that changed everything, where compassion met legacy, dedicated to the day Jamal Carter chose humanity over opportunity. Behind him stood a crowd of students, staff, reporters, and families, many of whom had come through the very programs he had built. Kids with backpacks filled with books, parents holding phones to record, young black and brown faces lit with the fire of possibility. Angela stood beside him, dressed in a flowing navy coat, elegant and radiant in the way only women who've conquered storms can be. She didn't cry. Not today. Today she stood tall, proud, arms crossed like a queen watching her empire expand. Not of wealth, but of impact. Of lives saved not through luck, but through intention. Jamal turned toward the group of teens nearest the plaque, wide-eyed, hopeful, waiting for him to speak. He crouched down beside a boy who couldn't have been older than 13, his face full of the same hunger Jamal once carried like a secret. "You know," Jamal said, voice low but sure, "I used to sit right there, right by that bench. No money, no plan, just me, my books, and a mom who believed in me more than the world did. One choice I made changed everything. You've got that power too." The boy looked up at him, nodding, maybe not fully understanding yet, but already holding on to the seed being planted in that moment. And that was the point. Jamal no longer needed applause or recognition. His name was on buildings, sure, but his legacy lived in people, in every student who got a second chance, every mother who found her strength, every community that now had resources because he dared to believe a different future was possible. And when he looked up into the crowd and saw a young girl in a wheelchair from East Oakland, now valedictorian of her class, when he shook hands with a former dropout, now running one of the new learning centers in Chicago, when he hugged a teacher from Atlanta whose classroom had electricity for the first time because of the foundation's new infrastructure program, he knew they were all part of the same story, a story that had once started in silence, in struggle, in overlooked corners of society, but had become something unshakable. And in the stillness of that evening, as the event wrapped and cameras turned off, Jamal and Angela sat down on the same bench where he used to study. No speeches, no flash. Just the two of them, watching planes lift into the sky. Angela rested her head lightly on his shoulder. "You did good, baby," she whispered. "You changed things." Jamal smiled, eyes glistening. "We did, Ma. We did." And in that quiet, under the glow of airport lights and distant jet engines. They simply sat, no longer running, no longer surviving, just breathing, proud and still, surrounded by the legacy they had built. And the world, once cold and indifferent, now carried their fingerprints, their fire, their name. Jamal Carter's story had come full circle, not as a tale of escape, but of return, of reclaiming, and of giving back. And as long as there were people willing to kneel beside the fallen, to choose kindness in the face of convenience, that legacy would never end. Sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive.